Hi everyone, and welcome to this tutorial video. In this video I'm going to be showing you how to paint a simple mountain landscape. In this example I used watercolour paints, but you don't have to use them. If you wanted to turn it into a drawing, then you can use pencils or pens, and you could just use this video as a guideline. I initially start off by sketching the basic outlines of the mountains in the background. They'll look smaller because they're at a further distance, but they're probably much larger mountains than the ones we'll have in the foreground. Once you finish sketching the mountains in the background, you can layer a couple of extra mountains in the foreground, and you'll already start to see a 3D effect with these mountains layered in front. Another good way of defining the different kinds of mountains is by giving the background mountains some very sharp peaks, but giving the foreground mountains much more curved and shallow peaks, so they're not so steep. That's a good way of defining the different shapes of the mountains, and it gives a good idea of the altitude. Once you finish sketching, it's time to start adding some colour. I like to start off with the background, so we'll start off with the blue sky. With watercolour, it was just a matter of adding some nice dark blues towards the top corners and then kind of blending it into the middle. So I was able to add some nice clouds that fade out towards the horizon. And then once the sky is coloured, it's time to start working on the mountains. It's a good idea to keep the mountains in the distance a little bit more faded. Obviously with the atmosphere they'll be faded, and with the distance they won't look so clear, so it's nice to give that effect with some lighter shading. And for these mountains I used black watercolour paint that I diluted with a lot of water, so it created a nice faded grey. In this example I'm imagining the sun is shining from the left, and so all of the darker tones and all the darker shading will be on the right side of the mountains. And this is a really good guideline for helping you simulate some accurate lighting. And it can even work really well on simple paintings like this one. Once we've finished working on the details of the faded mountains in the distance, it's time to start adding detail to the large mountains in front of those. I started off by adding all of the basic features of the mountain face with a faded light grey, just so that I can start to get the composition of each of these large mountain faces. It's always very important, whether you're working on a painting or a drawing, to start off with the light details first and then start to add the darker shading as you go on, because if you start off with the dark shading and then you make a mistake, you can't really go back from that. So it's good to start off light and then work your way up to the darker shading. And then once I finished adding all of the lighter shading to these mountains, and I feel like I'd created the correct kind of shape and ridges, I started to add the darker shading. It's important to remember that in this painting the darker shading should be going on the right side of the ridges and the mountaintop. And you'll really quickly start to see the 3D effect that this gives. I feel like this is a really simple and effective way of creating some nice realistic looking mountains. And then I continued to refine the details of these mountains as much as I felt I needed to. With these mountains being a bit closer to the viewer, they probably require a little bit more detail than the ones in the distance that looked a little bit more blurry. And so it's nice to give these mountains some sharper shading and details to stand out from those mountains in the background. With those mountains completed, it was time to start adding the colouring to the mountains in the foreground. I decided that in this example these mountains would be a lot lower than the other mountains, and so they'd actually have life and green on them. So for the first mountain I used a kind of bluey green. It's kind of like a pine colour, so I imagine this kind of mountain top to be covered in trees. And then for the mountain in the foreground I chose to use kind of a grass green watercolour. And so this would be like a grassy hill that's much lower in altitude than the other mountains, but it's much closer to the viewer, and so it looks a lot larger. As with the previous mountains, I started off by adding the lighter shading and continuing to leave some highlights and shadows that contrast with each other and define the shape of the mountain. Once that was complete, you could leave it there, but I decided to add a black silhouette drawing in front of it, a kind of a scene with a deer stag standing between two trees. This painting was actually a present for my mum, and she loves deer and she loves nature, and so I really wanted to make sure I added a deer to the scene in some way. For the black silhouette drawing, I used a brush pen. It simulates painting, and it works really well at adding a layer over the top of a painting like this one. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it was helpful in some way. This one is nice and simple to work on, and it doesn't take a very long time, apart from the time you have to take waiting for the paint to dry. But if you don't use watercolour paints, or you just use pencils or pens, then there's no waiting times and the drawing won't take very long at all. So if you work on anything similar, or if you followed this video along, then feel free to show me your work on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. If you enjoy drawing or painting videos, then be sure to subscribe to my channel, and any likes or shares on this video are hugely appreciated, and it really means a lot to me. If you want to follow me and check out the progress photos throughout the week, then be sure to check out the links in the description box below. And once again, thank you so much for the support on here. It really means a lot to me, and I love working on videos like this. If you have any video suggestions, then feel free to let me know. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you all soon.